It's 12 minutes past 5, something else that's a part of life ever since the frozen berry scare from, what was that, last month, 6 weeks ago. We are now more aware than ever of what's going into our mouths. Food. Where does it come from? How was it grown? What was the source? What's been done to it between the paddock and the plate? A lot of thoughts out there, a lot of misconceptions, a lot of myths. Some... well, they aren't myths, but then some are. So let's try and bust some of them right now. Sam Trethewey is no stranger to our program. Great friend of the show. We have had him on before. Get Muddy is his blog as part of the Fairfax family. Today, he is our agricultural myth buster. And Sam, you've taken time out of your uni studies as well. You're doing an MBA.
Yeah, mate. Pretty busy with that. So it's actually great to get out of the office and get down to the studio.
All right, then. Let's start busting some myths here about the Australian food, because I know this is one of your pet hates, especially being a man from the land. You sit down with friends, family from the city,
Yep.
and they come up with some weird and wonderful ideas, don't they?
They do. You sit down at dinner parties and, the Roundup, which is a chemical or genetically modified food, or animal welfare comes up. And, it seems a lot of people are an expert. And, many people in the industry get a bit frustrated. It's good to kind of write about some myths and bust them with, the real story.
All right, the first one you want to get across. Our chickens are pumped full of hormones. True or false?
False, that one. Yeah, so chickens haven't been administered hormones in Australia since around 1956, which is a huge surprise to many. Yeah, so...
but they're so big these days.
They are. But that's come purely down to breeding, mate. So we've been able to breed chickens with, bigger breasts and bigger thighs. The market demands, certain size cuts, and so farmers breed those.
And you don't need hormones to achieve this?
No, you don't, no. So it's just like, the example I gave is if you're going to build a rugby team, would you go to Queensland to build a rugby team, or would you go to China? Just genetically, the kind of people you find in Queensland will be a bit bigger than the Chinese. So that's the same thing. They pick breeds which are bigger birds, so...
All right, so chickens aren't pumped full of hormones. That's the first myth busted. You mentioned GM, genetically modified food. It's creeping into our meals day in, day out, isn't it?
That's a bit of a funny one. So it depends what you eat. No animals, fresh fruit or vegetables grown in Australia have been genetically modified at all. So
okay.
Yeah, so we only grow genetically modified cotton and canola in Australia.
Why do we do that?
Purely from a management point of view. So the pests and the chemicals that used to be required to grow conventional cotton, for instance, were pretty heavy. They had a lot of pests and things like that. So they've been able to create plants that are resistant to certain weeds, certain chemicals, and taste particularly bad to pests. So they've cut down about 85% of their sprays. Sometimes they used to spray up to 18 times a season on cotton, and now they only spray 3 times. So which is pretty good for the environment.
That's genetically modified, because most people think genetically modified. I don't want people playing God with my food, but
sure.
We do get that in Australia. It's not produced here, but we can get it from overseas. Is that right?
So genetically modified food, if it's purely genetically modified food, it's got to be labelled in Australia. It can creep in imported ingredients. If it's an ingredient, it can be imported and it's not necessarily labelled.
Okay.
Yeah, correct. So, in Australia, it's just GM cotton and GM canola, and if it's refined heavily, for instance, like canola oil and things like that, it doesn't have to be labelled because of the treatment process, everything's been removed. So,
all right, we are myth busting as far as food is concerned in this country because, well, as I mentioned before, ever since the frozen berry scare, we are more acutely aware now than ever, or more than ever, of what is going into our mouths. We want to know where food has come from. We want to know what has happened to it along the supply chain, because there are a lot of unknowns out there. And you know what? If you've got any questions for Sam, if you've got any perhaps arguments, bet settlers, anything like that you want to throw at Sam Trethewey, our agricultural myth buster, give us a call this afternoon, 13 13 32. Maybe it's just to get a better idea of what is going on our plates and served up into our lounge rooms, or dining rooms, as I should say, throughout the course of the year. All right, Sam, before we head to a break, because we've got one coming up, I want to ask you, hormones, we just mentioned that about chickens before, but what about hormones in beef? It's packed full of it.
Well, natural. I mean, everyone's got hormones in them. So,
Okay.
but yeah, obviously you're talking about hormones that have been applied to the animal. So that's what they call hormone growth promotants. They're applied to about 40% of Australia's beef herd, mainly in northern Australia, where the
What type of hormones are we talking?
so they're all natural. So they're naturally occurring progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone that are already in animals.
Yeah, okay.
However, they've put them into a little pill or a capsule, which is inserted under their skin. It's a lot like the implant things that some women get in their arms as a contraceptive.
Okay.
It's exactly like that,
Yep.
except that's actually a man-made hormone, whereas the ones they give beef are natural. So.
All right. Is there any harm in us consuming beef with that hormones in it or elevated hormones in it?
Not really. I mean, well, no, there isn't. Just to give you an idea of the amount of hormones that are in treated beef, you'd have to sit down and eat 77 kilos of HGP treated beef to consume the same amount of natural hormones you'd eat if you were to consume one egg.
Hang on, one egg.
Yeah.
77 kilos of beef.
Yeah.
I don't think I could do it in a sitting, but I'd love to give it a nudge. So 77 kilos is the equivalent of one egg.
Correct, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
All
it's so it isn't a lot, and it's natural anyway. So.
Because the moment you start hearing hormones getting into food, you start to worry. Okay, this is foreign. This is going into
Correct.
But it's all naturally occurring. And
Absolutely.
we shouldn't have to worry about it. All right, it's coming up to 19 minutes past 5. If you've got some questions, a few people calling in, we will get to them straight after we have a check of the roads in just a moment. Sam Trethewey is with us, getting muddy, getting down to business, and busting some of our food myths here in Australia. Right now, we are food myth busting. That's right, Sam Trethewey. He gets muddy. That's his blog. And he is also studying an MBA. He's a man from the land, and he's trying to bust some myths when it comes to, well, the food that goes from paddock to plate in our place. Now, Prue has phoned in with a question. Prue, go ahead. You've got Sam.
Hi, Prue.
Hi, Sam. I've got a question around New Zealand. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe, and I've heard, that China, that grows crops, etc., e.g. peas, beans, etc., comes into New Zealand where they can it in New Zealand and then transfer it across the Tasman, and we pick it up and buy it because we believe it's been processed and manufactured in New Zealand. Is there any truth in that?
To my knowledge, that is the case. Yeah, I do understand New Zealand import, frozen and canned, peas and carrots and things like that. Mix it in with their own, perhaps, and then package it up. So, which really brings us back to that point that it's really important, and it's hopefully getting increasingly easier to just buy Australian. And I was in one of the major retailers just on the weekend, and I saw frozen minted peas that had the Australian flag and everything all over it. So that is the case. It's usually labelled, but as I said, it's getting easier to buy Aussie, so which is a great thing.
Yeah, Prue, thank you for your call too. Hope that does answer the question because, Sam, that's the whole point. We know, and in the wake of the frozen berry scare, we heard that Australia's food standards and New Zealand's food standards, they're run by the same people,
They are.
are high, one of the highest on the planet. That's produced here.
Correct.
The problem is food coming in from overseas. We just don't know, and it's put back onto the suppliers. So that importance of buying Australian made, grown, locally produced, it's not only for our health, but it's also supporting the man on the land, isn't it?
Absolutely, and women, of course.
Oh, yes, sorry.
There we go. No, that's okay. But no,
Families on the land.
families. Yeah, no, you're spot on. It's really, really important to be doing that, and Australian consumers need to, because the way Australian agriculture has very small margins, so we're going to be starting to chase those higher end margins and leveraging that brand and that uniqueness, that clean, green, healthy image into key markets like Asia and stuff like that. So they're going to be paying premium prices for our produce. So that's where a lot of our produce will start to go, because we can get the price that we deserve. So if Australians don't start buying their own food and producing it, it won't be stocked. So I have to say, ultimately, it comes back to demand. What the consumer demand, the consumer gets.
Isn't that just the weirdest thing? Like, if we're looking for something cheap, we import it from overseas because it's just going to be good at the bottom line in the hip pocket. Yet overseas are looking at us saying, hey, this is the best food in the world. Let's import that. and we'll pay premium for it. That's just crazy.
I know,
we should keep it here. We should be paying what it deserves to be paid for.
Correct, yeah.
And not looking for the imported stuff. Nicole sent a text in, Sam. She said, hi, Ben and Sam, of course. Sorry. What about milk? There are so many brands. What's the most natural like we used to get when we were kids?
That's a really good question. I actually buy my milk from Mullaney Dairies since I've kind of moved up into Queensland. It's been great to know that's coming from a local farm, and they pull in a number of producers in their area to produce their milk. The yellow label one still has that nice chunk of cream up the top of the bottle.
Nice.
Sometimes you got to kind of poke it with a spoon so you can pour the milk out. So it's a good question. Milk's not my forte. I mean, everything's obviously Australian made, but of course down this way, if you support Norco and those local brands. Norco's owned by a cooperative of dairy farmers, so all the profits go back to them. And I suppose that's an argument we've seen with $1 milk and private label milk. Obviously, profits, which there are very few, obviously go to the retailers. Whereas if you stick with your brands like Paul's and Norco and all of those kinds of things, that goes back to the cooperatives and the actual companies. So.
Going back to the families
Correct.
On the land. All
Spot
right,
on.
Nicole, hope that answers your question. Now, Matt has sent a text saying Sam is wrong when he says heat treatment removes residuals from GMOs. It does not have any effect on the DNA of those organisms, so genetically modified organisms. Heat treatment. Did you say that?
I did. So I'm not a technician when it comes to that kind of stuff. However, just the current food safety standards that we have in Australia stipulate that any residues that may be present aren't deemed a threat. And all of this, I might add, is on the assumption that GM is actually bad for us. The perceptions around the GM debate, I dare say, that are one of the biggest issues. There's countries that have been living on GM food for 15 years and haven't had a problem. So,
and I guess that's what it's about. It's about perceptions. It's about people's ideas of what is going on. And as you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, that so many times you've been at dinner parties and people have their perceptions of what's going on there. We mentioned hormones in beef before, and I was speaking as if hormones in beef are bad, but I guess I get that because when I walk through the supermarkets, I see this hormone-free beef as if it's some big, bold, this is the stuff you should be buying.
Correct. And so the retailers aren't helping in that communication. So by posting hormone-free beef, they're almost creating the perception that hormones are bad, so you obviously want the free beef, and that other beef that isn't packaged with hormone-free beef on it has hormones in it. If you were to buy beef in southeastern Australia, down around Melbourne, Sydney, and places like that, the chances of having, the chances of it being treated beef is very, very slim because they don't use HGPs down there nearly as much as up here. So it's
is that because they don't need to?
They just don't need to. The quality of grass and feed down there isn't, is of a good quality. The breeds that they use, they get the productivity that they need. So.
Speaking of grass and grain fed.
Where are you taking this, Ben? Speaking of grass.
No. I'm not going down the car line just yet. What about grass and grain fed beef? Is that another myth? How much of a difference are we talking here?
Oh, that's getting quite popular with the whole paleo thing. Look, grass-fed beef is higher in polyunsaturated fats, and grain-fed is higher in saturated fats. So if that's something you're particularly worried about, there's something there. Ultimately, 40%. Actually, no, don't quote me on that statistic. I'll have to go back to that, but. There are quite a number of animals that are feedlotted in Australia. About 2% of the national herd at any one moment is in a feedlot, but the average time is only 50 to 70 days on grain. So unlike America, the majority of our beef is all grass-fed. It's just that a proportion of them are spend the last 50 to 70 days on grain. All
right. So why is that? Why do they switch? Why do they
do? It's for their fat. So the market, again, the consumer demands a fair bit of flavour, which comes from fat and marbling in meat, which is what grain gives it. And what consumers also prefer is a white, creamier looking fat than a yellowish fat. So the grain, that small amount of time gives the meat that white, creamy look. Whereas if it's on grass, it usually has that yellow-orange kind of looking fat, which isn't as perhaps attractive. And that comes from the carotenoids, which are in grass. And carotenoids, that's what makes carrots orange.
There we go. I was going to say, does it have anything to do with carrots? And it does. You've answered my question right there. Sam, an enthralling chat. I want to get you back a little later because, the whole the whole idea of agriculture in this country, we used to, I mean, it was built off the sheep's back. Now it's been mining, but the mining boom is over. So is agriculture the way to go? Is that where it is? So I want to bring you back about this. I know people have been phoning in as well. So if you do have any questions for Sam later down the track, we might catch up with him next week. You can email them to us as well. drive@4bc.com.au. He is our man on the land. Now, Robbie has said, why, when you get seafood from the supermarket, it tells you where it comes from, but they don't tell you on a restaurant menu?
That's a very good question. Very good question.
There you go. There's some homework for you.
I'll go hunt that down. I reckon I know the answer. It's got something to do with marketing purposes in restaurant margins, but we'll check it out. So.
All right. Sam Trethewey, thank you very much.